All right, here we go. We're going to talk about 5 measures of a healthy children's ministry. Now, there might be 10 measures or 15 measures. I don't know, like that could work. This isn't like the 5 measures. These are 5 measures, 5 different ones that you can use to figure out, is your ministry healthy? Is it operating at a place of health? Is it in a place where maybe some things need to be changed to help it become a healthy ministry? Now, for me, when I think about measuring health in ministry, children's ministry or any ministry, I think about 2 things, 2 key ways to measure health. I think that stories are one way, and what I'll call metrics are another. To me, stories is the most powerful way to measure health. So you listening to what people say about the ministry, how it's impacting them, listening to your volunteers, getting their feedback, talking to parents. I think that's the number one way to measure health. But the 5 things we're going to look at today are probably more on the metrics side. So before we jump in and talk metrics, just a couple or a few important notes to think about. Metrics are important. Now, some people think, it's church. We're talking about um, spiritual growth and the movement of God and the Holy Spirit. We don't need to measure things. We don't have to measure things. That's kind of like anti-God. I think sometimes some people have that perspective. I would disagree. I think it's important to know what is reality. So I think metrics are important. You don't want to throw them out, but they're not everything. They definitely aren't everything. That's why I said I think stories are the best measure of health. And every church is unique. So as I go through these 5 measures, you may realize, you know what? Our church is very different than that guideline or that benchmark that Nick is sharing. That's okay. That's normal. Every church is unique and there's different contexts. These are just guides. These are guides to help you figure out, okay, is this an area of health for my ministry? Or is this an area where it's not really healthy and maybe we could improve on that and make it a little bit healthier? So let's jump in and look at the first measure of health. We're not talking just attendance regularly. We're talking attendance. This first one is kids' attendance percentage. Now, most churches measure attendance. You probably have some attendance that you're tracking every week in your ministry. Maybe you look at it compared to last year or maybe a few years or something like that. This is the kids' attendance as a percentage of your whole church. And again, every church is different, but the way you calculate it is what is the average kids' attendance that you have in your church and divide that into your average total attendance. So for example, maybe you have 100 kids that attend on average in your church out of 500 total, including kids. So that means kids are 20% of the attendance of your church. Now, I know as we jump into all these measures, they're all going to be like this. We're going to tell you how to calculate it. Here's an example. Here's a goal or a benchmark. Some of you are thinking, math. I don't want to do math. That's why I got into ministry. In fact, today when I was before I came here, I saw a thing on the news that said in our state only, or at least in our city where I live in Maryland, in the city of Baltimore, only 11% of 8th graders are proficient in math. I thought that's not good. So some of you are thinking, yeah, I don't like math much either. Most of these metrics do involve some math, but I promise you it won't be too difficult. This one, and this is a good benchmark, I think, just to think about what percent of our church is made up of kids. So in the example I gave there, 100 kids out of 500, that's 20%. I would say the goal is somewhere between 15 and 25%. Now, there are a couple organizations out there that help churches. And specifically, one of them is Ministry Architects. They help children's ministries and student ministries. They recommend 15%. Tony Morgan and his team at the Unstuck Group, the average of the churches they work with is 20%. In my opinion, if your church is not really, really young, like you see a lot of new church plants, that our church was a church plant, like Kathy mentioned, in our first year, kids' attendance was 15% of the total. And that made sense because our church was so young, there weren't as many kids. Then churches with a higher average age, obviously, may have a lower percentage of kids. If your target or part of your target or who you're trying to reach and who you're trying to lead to follow Jesus is young families in your community, then I would lean more towards the 20%. A couple mitigating factors just to keep in mind when we're talking about attendance percentages. Again, every church is unique, but the average age of your church is the biggest influence here. If your average age of your church is higher, then obviously the kids' attendance percentage will be lower. But using this could be a good guide or a good jumpstart for some conversations about how to reach younger families and change that makeup in your church. Another gauge to look at is just your community. Go look at census data and figure out what percent of our zip code or our town or our city is made up of kids that are under 10 and under, something like that. And you could use that as a guide. So that's one measure, I think, just to see, what percent of our church is made up of kids. A second measure would be new kids that attend each week. How many new kids that are visitors are you seeing in a year? Now, this isn't talked about a lot. I've not seen a lot of great information on this. Even church-wide, there's not a lot of great information on this. But for example, maybe you would look at last year, and if you use a church management system or somehow you're doing kids check-in, look and see how many new kids visited your church last year. And let's say it's 50 new kids visited your church last year. The goal is to have as many new kids visit your church in a year as you have an average attendance in a week. I'll say that again because that might be confusing. So you want as many new kids to visit in a year as you have an average attendance in 1 week. So for instance, maybe you had 50 new kids that attended last year and your average attendance this year is 60. So you get 60 kids on average each week. So you have 50 new kids versus 60. I would say the goal is 60. You want to try to see if you can reach as many new kids in a year as you have an average attendance in a week. Now, again, this could be all over the place. You might have half that. You might have double that. And keep in mind, we're not talking about kids who have stuck and they're part of the ministry, they're attending regularly. We're just talking about visitors. The average church doesn't keep a lot of visitors. That's a whole different measure that we could talk about. But I just think you want to have an idea of how many new kids are we reaching. And if it's a lot less than your average attendance each week, if you look at a whole year, then maybe you guys have to figure out, how can we invite more? How can we empower our families to invite their friends? How can we do, maybe it's an event or some kind of initiative or something to reach more young families? So those are two measures. Now we're going to talk about a couple measures that relate to your volunteer team, which I think to measure the health of a ministry, it's key to measure the health of volunteers. So the third measure that you can use is volunteer ratios. Now, in children's ministry world, we know all about volunteer ratios, but usually you're talking about how many volunteers do I need for, each in the nursery versus in 3-year-old room or in elementary. This is a little bit different. This is just looking at how many volunteers you have in relation to how many kids you have each week. So the calculation is, how many volunteers do you have on average each week versus how many kids do you have on average each week? So for example, you might have 30 volunteers on average each week serving in your kids ministry, and you might have 180 kids. So your ratio would be 30 to 180 or 1 to 6. And again, math may not be your thing. You're thinking, I'm not sure I know how to calculate that. It doesn't have to be exact. Just roughly figure out, how many volunteers do you have compared to how many kids you have. So in this example, a church would have roughly 1 volunteer for every 6 kids on a Sunday. And I think the goal is about 1 to 5. Now, again, there's mitigating factors here. How much programming do you do? Like, do you have multiple hours of different programming on a Sunday morning? Well, then you're probably going to need more volunteers per, the number of kids, because kids are attending multiple times. Volunteer rotations are another mitigating factor. Now, that's why I asked specifically how many each week, not how many total, because you might have people that serve once every other week or once a month. So that's why I think it's helpful to look at how many volunteers do we have on a Sunday, and then how does that compare to how many kids we have. Now, you may be thinking, I don't need to be told that I don't have enough volunteers. None of us have enough volunteers, right? But I think there's something powerful about knowing how many you need, and that'll relate to this next measure as well. So the next measure would be volunteer prospects. If you're like most children's ministry leaders, then you always want more volunteers. And so the question is, how many volunteer prospects do you have? And a lot of times when I talk with ministry leaders about, their ministry and they need more volunteers, I'll say, how many volunteers? And they'll say, more, right? How many more? I don't know, just more. Well, I think it's important as a ministry leader to know your team, to know how many volunteers you have and in what roles, and to know how many you need. Maybe you have 8 volunteers, but if to be well staffed on a Sunday and carry out this ministry well, I'm doing it with 8 right now, but I need 12. I need 4 more volunteers. Well, I think a good measure would be to always keep track of how many prospects do you have. And what you want to do is, prospects are people who could serve in your ministry. That's it. Like, you don't have to know them. They don't have to have already expressed interest. A volunteer prospect is somebody who could serve in your ministry. And so what you do is you make a list. You make a list of those people, those names, and here's the goal. If you, however many volunteers you need, you want 4 times as many prospects. So for example, if you needed 15 more volunteers to fill the open roles on your team, then you want 60 prospects. And it goes like this. You get 60 names on a list. And here's some notes, by the way, that can help you with this. You don't have to know them. Like I mentioned, you get 60 names on a list. You could get those names from searching your church management system or just talking with people and figuring out who attends here at our church but isn't currently serving on a team. Or maybe it's people who are in a Sunday school class or a small group and they're not serving, and they're not serving on a team. They could be put on your prospect list. And what you do is you want to constantly grow that list and then contact them about serving. But the approach I would take, and we could spend a lot more time talking about this, is I wouldn't just contact them first about serving. I would contact them just to hear their story, ask them about taking the next step. Like, what's the next step you think for you and your spiritual growth? Or how can I help you take that step here at our church? And maybe serving on your team will be part of that. Maybe it won't, but either way, that's good. You're helping pastor them. So I think if you go back, a good exercise would be to say, how many volunteers do I need? Okay, I need this many. Well, then I need 4 times that many prospects. And then go figure out, how can I make a list of prospects in our church that I could ask to serve? Most leaders I talk to feel like there's nobody, everybody's already serving, or everybody else has already told me no. They run from me in the hallways when they see me on Sunday. I get that. But I think something that's powerful about this is making this list and being intentional about it every week, spending time on it, helps you realize, you know what? There are more people than you think. And there are more people that aren't serving who are out there that you could invite to serve in your ministry. Now, the last measure, the 5th one, is still kind of in the volunteer realm, but it's going to relate to leadership. I know when we launched our church, I had 30 children's ministry volunteers in that first year. Now, we were a lot larger of a church plant. It wasn't a typical church plant. We probably had about, I want to say, 80 kids attending on average. And I had about 30 total volunteers, not on a Sunday, but total. And I led all of them directly. And in fact, over the next few years, our church grew and the ministry grew, and we had 60 volunteers, which was great. That was good. I don't even remember how many we needed. I just know that I had 60. We probably needed 80 or something. But I led all of them directly. That was really bad for them, okay? Because I'm not that good of a leader to lead 60 people. Even 30 people, I couldn't do well. So this 5th measure is about span of care. And it's all about how many people can any one person adequately care for and lead and invest in. Well, that's span of care, and Carl George talks about this in a few of his books, which they're must-reads. Breaking Through Church Growth Barriers is one of them. But the way you calculate it is, how many total volunteers do you have? And then divide that by how many total leaders you have, meaning people that directly lead those volunteers. So for example, in my case, I had 30 volunteers and me. I had 1 staff person. So my span of care was 30. And when it grew to 60, my span of care was 60, which is not good. Or in your case, you might have 50 volunteers, but you have 5 leaders. You have like a nursery, room leader and like an elementary leader or whatever. And so in that case, you'd have 50 volunteers, 5 leaders. So the span of care would be 10, 10 people for every leader. I think the goal is something like 10, something like 8 to 12. I think, in my opinion, that's how many people we can adequately care for, especially a volunteer who's given their time. We can probably expect a volunteer who's going to lead a team of volunteers to care for about 8 to 12. And in our case, sometimes we see it's even less than that. But imagine 6 leaders who lead 10 volunteers, right? That's 60 people, and the span of care is 10. That's a good number versus what I was doing, which was me, one person leading 60 volunteers. And I'm just telling you, it was not a great experience for them. In the church world, I would say a buzz around this lately has been this label of coaches, the idea of getting volunteer coaches in place to lead other volunteers so that you're not doing it all yourself. I think that's great. Whatever you call it, you could call it whatever name makes sense, team leader, coach, coordinator, whatever it might be. But the goal is, can I give away leadership? Can I give away responsibility to somebody who can lead a team? And don't, I think one of the dangerous things is if you don't have this in place now, like I didn't when I had 60, it gets scary if you start thinking, man, I need 6 right now. Well, that's going to be hard to do. I say find one. Can you find one leader that you're going to ask to step into this role of a coach or a coordinator or something like that, and you help them. They get to watch you do what you do, and you empower them and you equip them and lead through them, and then you find another one. You find a second one. It took us 3 or 4 years probably to recruit not even 100% coaches, but to get maybe 80% of our coach roles filled. And then it took us probably another 3 years to really develop that team, that coach level of leadership into a good place. But I'm glad we did, because now our staff would not be able to do what we do if we didn't have them in place, because the span of care would be too great. So those are 5 measures that I think about. In our case, we don't look at these all the time. It's not something like I track regularly. We're like most churches. We track attendance and a handful of other measures in our ministries. I wouldn't say these are ones we track all the time, but they're ones I like to come back to just as a snapshot. I had to go to the doctor last week because I got a cold 2 weeks ago. It stuck with me. I still feel like I have it a little bit in my voice. And you know what the doctor asked? They asked questions about how I'm doing. They took some measures, blood pressure and heart rate. And unfortunately, they asked me how much I weigh. That wasn't fun. And so they used the combination that we're talking about of stories and hearing about what it's like and measures. And so those are 5 measures. I hope they're helpful to you. I know, again, there was some math involved there. I'd love to answer any questions you have about that. But I think they can be a great tool for measuring the health of your ministry and figuring out, where do I need to spend my time to help it become even more healthy.